who thank you to everyone who could join us. And I'm going to hand it back over to Jillian. Thank you.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen to get started on this presentation. I want to thank everyone for joining today. I know it's early for you, but I think there's a lot of resources we're able to share that will be very helpful to your region, and we're excited to have you here. So let me go ahead and get started. One moment. Great. So yes, just as a quick introduction, my name is Jillian Ertel. I'm Senior Program Officer for Under2 Coalition at Climate Group, and I'm working with my partners at the Center for Climate Strategies, Ariana, Nick, and Tom Peterson, who are joining us today, and we're going to be going over some opportunities regarding accessing federal funds for U.S. states, regions, and localities. So this is just quickly the agenda. It'd be great if you were able to put your organization name or the government in which that you work for and your name. And there will be discussions throughout this presentation, and it'd be great to have as much participation as possible. So feel free to raise your hand, just hop in or pop in the chat. So what we're doing here is the Green Recovery Alliance. We are a partnership again between Climate Group and Center for Climate Strategies, and we are attempting to do as much targeted state and local. One second, a bunch of people are joining. It's hard to do tech and speak at the same time sometimes. But yeah, so we're providing tailored support to these U.S. subnational governments to try to get as much acquisition and targeted individual assistance for these economic recovery schemes, such as the Infrastructure Investment and Job Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. And I'll pass it over to CCS to give a little bit of background on what they do.
So this is Tom Peterson. I'll get started here. I'm the president and CEO for the Center for Climate Strategies, and we've been working closely with the Climate Group on this project now for a stretch. We've also done other initiatives inside and outside the United States with the Climate Group and in support of the Under2 Coalition. So it's really a great pleasure to be partnering with them here.
Great. Yes. So the objectives and scopes of this initiative is, again, to support state and local governments in the development of the deployment of the IIJA and IRA. And we do this by identifying, addressing key needs and opportunities, and we try to integrate the climate change, economic recovery, equity, and justice actions from these schemes. And another component is identifying priority sources and uses of funds and programs based on the incentives and deployment mechanisms, as well as providing capacity, coordination, acceleration, and technical assistance. And we'll go more into this as this presentation goes forward. Yeah, so this is just a bit of the timeline and the project activities that I've done so far. It says selection of at least 5 states, regions, and localities. However, as the project has gone on, we have expanded that a little bit, and that is why we're having this presentation today. And we figured that this regional approach to the Midwest could be resourceful and helpful to the project and your region. And so in the fall of 2022, we did briefings based off of the IIJA and ERA, and they were sector specific on transportation, energy supply, and buildings. And then the intent is to identify 1 or 2 priority programs for each jurisdiction and then match funding based off of that. And so once it is done, the assessment of the capacity gaps and technical assistance and assistant needs are addressed. And so the end products that we're looking for through this initiative include the identification of these programs and incentives and what are the requirements, and to match these with your jurisdictions and the priority programs in which you decide. And so the guidance on how to close these gaps and meet needs through the deployment. It's also one of these end products, and of course, the technical assistance to enable the cooperation and funding applications. I think I will pass it over to CCS at this point to move us forward. Thank you.
Ariana, would you like me to do this, or would you like to do the early stage slides here?
Go ahead, Tom. It's fine.
Okay. And I don't think Ariana was introduced, but why don't you do that right now, Ariana?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Arianna Ogliano. I'm Senior Project Manager, Policy Analyst with the Center for Climate Strategies. So maybe actually, Tom, sorry, before you go ahead, just a couple of notes here, because some of you may have noticed that the project timeline says April 2023 as the end of the project. So this is right, the timeline right now. We are working under a grant from the New York Community Trust Fund, and we are seeking for an extension of the project. So there will be hopefully more time to work with you that just basically are getting to know us right now. And also, just to clarify up front, the kind of assistance we are provided is funded by the New York Community Trust Fund. So it's going to be, there is not any need for like financial support from you if you need our help. Just want to make this clear up front, because sometimes it's one of like the misunderstanding on issues and concerns that you might have. Tom, go ahead.
Well, thanks. And then Nick, maybe you could introduce yourself also before we hop in.
Sure. Hi, I'm Nick Egelhoff with CCS. I'm actually from Wisconsin and went to Michigan State. So it's great to see everyone doing climate work in the Midwest.
Fantastic. There are other folks on our team who are not here, who you may run into if and as we progress here. So we've got the core group here. Just to underscore the climate change problem that everybody, I think, is well familiar with, and the fact that there is an emissions gap. And so that has been a driving force behind both the infrastructure legislation and the Inflation Reduction Act. And we'll show you a little bit more about it. But it's very important to remember that this is a core objective in both forms of legislation. In some cases, there are greenhouse gas reduction requirements. In other cases, there are encouragements, and it really kind of depends. We'll sort of sort through that for you. But, the bottom line is emissions have been increasing and they need to come down. There's a very significant gap. The missing ingredient has been money, and being able to get the necessary financial resources and other forms of capacity behind the actions that are required to close this gap by putting in place policy measures that are implemented at full scale, at full program and market scale. So we're going to be talking about these activities in that context. Go ahead. Another big driver is economic recovery. Inflation has been predominantly driven by energy prices in the United States. So what you will also see here is a real focus on methods for minimizing, reducing, or even reversing energy price-driven inflation. And then equity. So in addition to emissions gaps, we've seen very significant equity and access gaps in many areas for a long time. And so both forms of federal legislation are designed specifically to close these gaps at the same time as we are closing emissions gaps and addressing energy price issues and economic recovery needs. And this has been formalized in various ways, and we'll walk through that in just a minute.
So how did you feel about that, Clara? Other than that, how did you feel about it?
I think we may have a little bit of background information. So if you're not on mute, go ahead and do that so we can move forward. So the basic process that is happening here is matching sources and uses of funds. So the end uses of funds to be implemented by state, local, and other and tribal governments, as well as the private sector. Those end use activities in buildings, transportation, energy need to be matched with sources of funding to support their implementation. And so what we see is the intersection between sources and uses being expressed in the form of a specific program that enables the mobilization and distribution of funding to make this happen. Number of issues come up at the state and local level along the way. Information gaps, technical assistance gaps, coordination gaps, capacity gaps, a lot of equity gaps, and important steps required to address them, innovation gaps, and other things. And so really state and local and regional governmental entities and implementing partners typically face one or more of these kinds of problems as they step forward to try to increase the amount of attention that's being paid to these issues. I guess the first thing to do here is I want to acknowledge the obvious, which is I'm sure all of you are already pretty well familiar with the federal legislation and already have been looking at ways to move forward with it and already starting to identify some opportunities, but also some challenges. And we kind of wanted to be sensitized to your experience so far, and as we craft our comments going forward, because they'll focus on firstly on the Infrastructure Act and second on the Inflation Reduction Act. But we know you're not starting from scratch. You've already been heavily involved in both of these. Probably it would be really helpful if you could just let us know what has stood out so far in terms of the challenges that you think you have and are going to have in pursuing these federal funds and incentives. And really would just invite you to use an open floor to jot any notes in the chat or raise your hand.
Go ahead, Heather.
Yeah, thank you. I'll just say one of the things that I've been hearing is depending on how the federal funds are, being distributed, if they're going to states or if they're going directly to cities, has left some folks concerned that they might be left out if they're not in a state that is really leading or has an existing climate action plan. So I think, understanding which funds are, how different funds are being channeled to whom and how they can best access those and get on board with the different state agencies and departments is something that I'm hearing a lot about.
Absolutely. We'll be sure to pick that all up. And I see a note from Anna. One of the challenges, the guidance hasn't come out yet. And so we have been saying now for a long time that we were expecting federal agency guidance to come out in a number of areas, and it's been delayed, but it does look like there's a pretty big push now for at least some critical things to come out very soon. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund solicitation may appear next week, and the climate reduction grant by EPA may appear in about 3 weeks. So we're and environmental justice grants are appearing now. So hopefully we will get that guidance. We'll tell you what we know and talk a little bit about that as we go through our presentation. Then there's the direct payment issue. We will cover that. So that is a new and very important element of incentives that parallels taxable tax-based tax credits and moves them to non-tax entities. So we'll pick that up. And the nexus with climate change and funding is a big one. In some cases, And as you know, it's direct, but in other cases it's indirect. And we'll try to cover both of those things. I would just call out that as we've talked with local governments in different parts of the country, we've heard repeatedly the need for expanded capacity, expanded internal capacity for program development and management, and then expanded capacity with proposal and project partners to actually get the work done to take full advantage of the funding. So I think we're going to try to touch on capacity needs, but we'd really like to hear more from you as we go through this in terms of your specific needs for capacity that could be addressed. And Aaron, I see you commented on some of those things right now, so we'll try to do that. Well, maybe we should hop on, but we'll try to carry these forward. And please don't be shy as we go forward. If you have questions, pop your hand up or drop something in the chat, and we'll try to stay on top of that. The Infrastructure and Investments Job Act has a terrible acronym, EJA, that will probably drop and instead call this the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and the acronym is BIL. But anyway, they're both the same. And the short story on that is probably referring this is simply to the infrastructure legislation. But anyway, this appeared earliest, and we'll walk through this now. Again, multiple objectives here. Both formula funds and competitive funds. The formula funds go to states, often with matching requirements, and as they do, may or may not involve a local government relationship automatically. Where it's not automatic, it's often invited or encouraged. But these funds go first to the states, and they're competitive grants. And local governments typically have direct access and are directly eligible for these, but will be competing with other entities just depending on the eligibility provision of the program. And in all cases, well, not in all cases, but in many cases, matching funds are required. A lot of those matching levels are at traditional levels, but some of them have been changed. Some of them have been reduced, waived, et cetera. Right. Cross-cutting issues. So workforce development is typically required in all of these areas as something to build into the proposal and the implementation activity. And Justice 40. And Justice 40 focuses on ensuring that 40% of the benefits of the invested dollars or of the dollars themselves go to disadvantaged communities as beneficiaries, and that there's an engagement process with underserved and disadvantaged communities. There are, just a heads up, when we go over the Inflation Reduction Act, we'll pick up some additional metrics, which will be things like low and moderate income, overburdened, et cetera. But we do have social equity targeting and tracking criteria and measurements that need to be met through these program proposals. And there are various ways in which those metrics can be applied and calculated, but this is quite critical. And this is designed not only for urban and metropolitan communities, but also rural communities and what we call populations with common traits, that are dispersed in rural areas. So it really covers a pretty wide swath. As I mentioned, matching funds. And then just to note that the flow of funds from these solicitations to applicants is preceded by federal government, and in many cases even state government, meeting early stage requirements. And so the money can't flow until the federal and state government do these things. So you'll see a number of areas where a state agency is required to submit a plan for approval to a federal agency prior to the disbursement of funds through a solicitation in this program. And that process by which the state actually submits a plan is one that itself can involve local government, and really is an area to keep your eyes on, because that will be one of the early stage determinants of your relationship with the state agency and the downstream program that emerges. A lot of technical assistance resources. My organization was one of the 2 lead contractors for the Department of Energy in implementing the American Reinvestment and Recovery Act. It's been 12, 13 years ago. And at that time, DOE contracted out technical assisted resources. Now they've brought, along with other agencies, the technical assistance in-house in a kind of a major way. So there are many, many federal agency technical assistance resources. This is a listing of some of them, but there are many. And then there are other technical assistance resources out there, some at the association level, et cetera. Really kind of a large pool of technical assistance, but this is critical because it's a bit of a job to get through the access to these programs. So I think what we will do now is just a kind of a quick tour of some of the major Infrastructure Act funding programs and deadlines, and then maybe we'll zoom in a little bit. But let me just take a step back, if I might. If I have the count correct, the Infrastructure Act includes 375 separate funding programs. It's just too many to be able to keep track of. And where does that leave you? And what we've kind of said and heard now for a long time is the better approach to trying to keep track of all 375 is for you to really understand your priorities in these different sector areas of activity: energy, buildings, transportation, with the really strong likelihood that there will be funding available for those priorities somewhere in this legislation. So you can come at it from your own perspective in terms of your priorities and search for grant programs that match those. And that's one way to do this. The other way to do this is to watch out for things that are appearing in the near future and see whether they're a match, and at least know what those upcoming opportunities are and whether they make sense in terms of your priorities. I think we're going to try to do a little bit of both of those here, but we're not going to cover all 375. You can download a nice spreadsheet with those, and we can make that available, that lists all of them and their eligibility requirements, their end use activity requirements, their prospective deadlines, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's a pretty big database. And then the technical assistance resources we just showed you can help you do that. There are a number of searchable databases here. But in terms of readiness for engagement, maybe the most important thing to do is for you to have a sense of your priorities and where you think you could need support. That said, let me just stop and see, Nick and Adriana, how you'd like to do these slides, whether you'd like us to do a verbal walkthrough or just share them visually before we get into the individual things.
I don't know, Tom, I don't think we need to go through these tables. You know, we can maybe just do a walk through some of the programs, but if our audience has any specific program in mind that they would like us to discuss, that also, you know, could be a way to do this. We really would like to be most helpful to you all. So if you feel there is any program you would like us to focus on, we can do that. Or otherwise, I would just go ahead with the slides.
And literally, if there's a program or a need related to the generation of renewable power or enabling actions like energy storage or transmission. That would be really helpful to know about. And those are areas that are covered within buildings. Energy efficiency in general is one of the real strong areas of emphasis, but that includes a lot of end use implementation of specific technologies like heat pumps, for instance. And so it'd be helpful, for you to think about, where your priorities are in those areas. And let me just give you a little heads up on that, because we'll switch over and talk about the Inflation Reduction Act in a minute. And these two pieces of legislation can come together in areas where we have tax incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act that support these end use activities, homeowners, consumers, businesses, that can be provided either taxable or non-tax direct pay incentives for the adoption of new technologies. But on the other hand, on the infrastructure side, and even within the Inflation Reduction Act, there may be programmatic support for these areas that would enable a local government to expand its program capacity to support the deployment of these incentives. And I raise this because one of the issues that has come up in other conversations is a very significant concern that the absorption rate for incentives is low. And to get that absorption rate up at a high level to support your programmatic goals, you need capacity. The good news is there are incentives. There's also the potential for expanding capacity, but both of these things are needed at the same time. So when you look in the building sector, this is one of the areas where these incentives-based programs for end-use activities are very important. In transportation, the Infrastructure Act includes two general areas. One is the electrification of transportation. So we see incentives for vehicle acquisition, as well as funding programs for EV charging infrastructure. So bringing those two things together. This also can dovetail back to the energy supply sector, where you have opportunities then to increase the percentage of power that is used by electric vehicles from renewable energy sources. So you can do tie-ins here. And this is something that the federal agencies very much want to see. But we see electrification in passenger vehicles, light-duty trucks, heavy-duty trucks, buses, really across the board. We also see public transportation and regional transportation planning, which gets into infrastructure and community design issues and expanding non-automobile alternatives and system-based improvements and the installation of new facilities along those lines, transit, et cetera, that can help reduce the amount of driving that people do and the amount of energy that's consumed in transportation. So we see both of those areas. And not sure how many of you are directly involved in your transportation planning activities at the local level, but there also are pretty clear spellouts in some of the transportation grant funding opportunities that require greater involvement by the state with local government in putting together low carbon transportation plans, and otherwise stronger cooperation across transportation, energy, and environment. So I think the intent here is to try to integrate the objectives of this legislation institutionally by bringing forward the energy and environmental and transportation agencies through these grant programs. So that's something that you will see repetitively here as well. The other thing just to look for, and we'll comment on this a little bit more, is there's a set of activities, environmental justice grants. We'll look at these under the Inflation Reduction Act that have a core objective of environmental justice, but accomplish it through activities that take place in the sectors. And what we've certainly heard from a number of jurisdictions is that they already have plans for improving equity and access, specifically for social equity reasons. And they really do need help in being able to expand those programs. And so there's a real opportunity now in the legislation to do that. So you might come at it from that angle as well. Affordable housing, affordable acquisition of vehicles, a lot of affordability issues, the affordability of energy, et cetera. So that's a little bit of an overview as we, kind of skip through an overview of some of these programs. So a question about from Anna about planning. What we'll do in a minute is we'll talk about one very specific opportunity that I want to plant a seed in right now that, according to EPA, could be announced in a couple of weeks. And this is the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program under the Nick, I can't remember whether this is under the Inflation Reduction Act or under the Infrastructure Act, one or the other, but that is specifically designed for states, tribes, and localities in a two-phase program to get money for planning and assessment and capacity building, to be followed by money for implementation of programs. So maybe we'll talk about that in just a little bit, but that is one that's very specifically designed for planning. A number of other cases, planning is really embedded in the grants, and it could be explicit. You really have to read the grant, or it's implied and eligible, so you can be proactive and write it into the application. What we have been hearing and saying in response is not, if you have capacity needs, do not leave them to chance. As you put together applications, do not be shy about explaining where you need capacity expansion to support program adoption and expansion, and take it from there. I think the federal agencies are intending to be responsive to that need. Again, if you don't see it explicitly, don't be shy about calling it out. Okay, we can probably hop on. Yeah, so the series of slides that I believe are being recorded and you'll have available, a little bit of the treetops in terms of what we have heard and kind of figured out are likely to be some of the highest priority needs for local government. So, you definitely can circle back to them. We've got a series of slides here that have the details around each of those programs. And let me just give you the basic architecture of this, and then maybe, you'll be able to go back through these slides and we can do very quick touches on them. But there's a scope and a level of funding. So it's very important to understand what the eligible end use activities are, and also the eligible recipients of funding. It's also very important to understand the cost share, both the level of cost share and the type of cost share funding that is eligible. So really big picture, before this legislation came forward, I think the recognition in the United States and outside the United States has grown, and I don't think it's too much to say dramatically, that there is an enormous gap in mobilizing resources for the implementation of climate change actions. Whether you look at the Paris Agreement, any other significant goal that exists worldwide and in any given country, there's just a very, very big investment gap. And it's really very difficult to envision that public funding alone is going to close that gap. And so we've seen the emergence of a whole huge emphasis on the mobilization of private investment to help close that gap, because in the long term, undoubtedly, the major sources of funding that can address climate implementation needs come out of private wealth and private funding. When the Inflation Reduction Act was put in place, and when the Infrastructure Act was put in place, I think there was a very clear recognition, and it shows up in certain parts of the legislation, that this funding would be a bridge towards the longer term transition to private sector funding for these activities. And so the matching funds here are one of the mechanisms that is used to encourage that process to get moving now, to go out now and seek private sources, debt equity grant funding from private institutions, to be able to supplement and subsidize the federal investment that is being brought forward. And that is specifically intended to structure long-term mechanisms for private financing and to install the capacities at all levels of government to do that. So just to underscore that point, it will be a very big one as we switch over to talking about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund by EPA, but it shows up repetitively, in the Infrastructure Act. As I mentioned, eligible parties are spelled out, and there's some real details around that. Then dates, and there are prospective dates, and and then there are the real dates. So I think the federal agencies, so far as we hear, have been working really, really hard to move all these deadlines forward to actual notices of funding opportunity. But there have been a lot of delays, and probably there will continue to be delays. But anyway, there's in the technical resources list, there are some portals that you can use for staying on top of these deadlines. So you'll see this general set of things, and then some background resources for each and every one of these programs. Now, the other thing to call out, this is the CMAQ program, and it's a pretty good example in the Infrastructure Act of a transportation program that encourages but does not require greenhouse gas emissions reduction. You switch over to the Inflation Reduction Act and you will actually see requirements. But in the Infrastructure Act, a lot of this is softer than requirements. It because of the legislative process, ended up at a stage where there were encouraging opportunities rather than mandating opportunities. So that's one thing to be aware of. And in terms of encouragement, what you see, and CMAQ is a perfect example, is for the first time, eligible activities under CMAQ and a series of other traditional programs now have been opened up for more creative use. So you can use these funding sources now in the case of transportation for things other than road expansion. For instance, you can use them for other forms of transportation efficiency and alternatives. And so you want to look into these programs and just ask yourself, is there a way that we could use these more creatively, and double check to be sure that's eligible, but typically the intent of that is eligible. The other thing I'll call out for you, we go back to that slide with that poor little frog and the climate change emissions going up. The analysis of the Infrastructure Act at large and its effect on reducing emissions in the United States tells two stories. One story is if the funding is implemented in a creative and constructive manner that is designed to reduce emissions as much as possible within the structure of these programs, we get a reduction from our business as usual trajectory of emissions in the United States, and it's a pretty big reduction. The other story is if this funding is used in a business as usual manner, the effect of the Infrastructure Act is actually to increase emissions over business as usual levels in the United States. So part of what's happening here is really trying to ensure that these funds will be used to do the former and not the latter. And part of that's a direct effect with local governments, state governments trying to put these funds in place in a way that will be different. But then also to indirectly be working with other parties who are going to be doing this. So what we see in the non-governmental community is a lot of focus on trying to encourage transportation agencies to use these funds for alternative purposes rather than traditional purposes, because the stakes are very high. If this is traditional, emissions go up. So it's a lot to unpack, but this congestion, the CMAQ program is really a bit of a tip of a spear here in terms of what's at stake as we go through the energy and transportation programs, and both the opportunity and then the implication of not fully realizing it. Let me just stop there. See if there are any questions, and we won't spend as much time on the future slides. Okay, we'll just do a quick hit. A lot of traditional programs here. The state energy program is another one. I'm not sure how many people we have on who are representing the energy programs within local government, but here's an area where the crosswalk between sustainability, environment, and buildings, becomes a very, very big one, as well as for energy generation. The other thing I would just note that pops up here and really throughout, in addition to matching funds being a requirement, typically what the federal agencies are looking for is a clear description of the end use of funding and the mechanism by which it will be put in place, and specifically the partnerships at the community level, whether it's private sector, whether it's community groups, whatever, that will be involved in that. So partnerships are a very, very big deal. And what I think is happening now is states and localities are going through a mapping exercise for these things, saying, okay, if we want to move forward, what are our program mechanisms? What's the level of funding we need for the specific activities? Who do we need to partner with? And let's be in touch with them, now, because they should be really a part of putting in place the applications for funding. Go ahead. Anything to ask or to add about the infrastructure funding? Well, maybe I'll just go back and note one thing, that statement of the obvious. Now would be a really good time, as I'm sure you've already done, to be in touch with your states to understand what their plans are for infrastructure funding and where you can be working with them to ensure a flow of funds for local government for your uses. And we see just a heck of a lot of variation across states in terms of the relationship with local government. So this is now an open opportunity at a pretty specific level to sit down with your state counterparts and have this conversation. Okay. Well, feel free to call anything else out as we go forward. Let me just see. Heather, I see your question. Do you want to open that up and check for any thoughts on that?
Sure. I'm just, as I put in the chat, I'm just curious how much engagement is happening right now. And I was at a conference last week, the Midwest Energy Efficiency Alliance conference, and they had a panel of representatives from state energy offices. And, not every state has, they have a designated person who fulfills the role of state energy office, but it's often they're housed somewhere else. So it was just eye-opening for me just to see how the different states are structured, what sort of staff is designated in these different offices. So, if anybody else is willing to put in the chat, what sort of communication you've had with your state energy office, I'd be really, really curious. And I'm happy to reach out to folks and, convene additional meetings or gatherings, if that's helpful. And maybe I'll follow up with folks after this too, if people are quiet on the chat. Oh, thanks, Aaron.
Heather, the other part of that question that has come up is within local government itself. In some cases, we've heard about a little bit of stovepiping, where we've been working with people who are in sustainability departments or public works departments, but not always as engaged with their counterparts running energy programs as they might be, and then ditto for transportation. So it would be helpful to know what level of engagement within local government is taking place as well.
Yeah, that's a great point. Because yeah, in some places there's maybe it's the public works folks or it's the building division. I mean, I don't think the city of St. Louis has a specific, if they have an energy office, it's somebody who's fulfilling some other role, and that's a title that's not really, publicized very well. So it changes, I think, from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, and even just identifying those folks can sometimes be a challenge.
Well, Heather, we would look forward to follow up on that. And maybe one of the things to do is to scout out those specific grant and incentive opportunities that relate to this and see whether that can become a focal point for some engagement. Well, I think we can hop on to the next section here. IRA, as we call it, also multiple objectives. Similar, but we're seeing more sharpening on a couple of these, including economic recovery and greenhouse gas emissions. But definitely we're back in the environment here of accomplishing multiple objectives. Yeah, 369 billion. It's a big number. And where that really leaves us is huge opportunities, but also really huge challenges for the full use of these funds, their full absorption. And a big chunk of this is in tax credits and direct pay. So Treasury plays a central role here in the guidelines and the administration of the program. Talk in just a minute about the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund and others. Okay, so a slew of tax credits and direct pay. Some of these are traditional with enhancement, some of them are new. There's the tax credit section, and then there's direct pay, which is possible with many of these. And this is really the first time that enables a local government, for instance, or another tax exempt organization to be able to directly benefit from what would have been a tax credit that was eligible only for a taxable entity. So it's a new ballgame. You guys can play in this tax credit market through direct pay. The other thing, just to note, big picture, this has been noted recently for electric vehicles, but when we talk about tax credits for end use activities where consumers, businesses, others will be buying something and then waiting for a tax credit that they can obtain later, is Treasury has been loosening some of the requirements to allow that tax credit to be captured at the point of sale in the form of a discount on the sales price. So you don't have to wait. And just a heads up on that. I know that in the electric vehicle area, that's been a really big one, but it's starting to spread into other areas as well. Grants and loans also. Big emphasis on affordable housing, low and moderate income. Maybe in the greenhouse gas reduction fund, if you could go back to the last slide, let me just, and this will carry forward to the next slide, but I mentioned earlier that it's important to try to figure out and you can get help doing this, how you would take funding that comes to you, either directly from the federal government or from the state government, then get it out to distribute it to end users, consumers, homeowners, businesses. And just to note that money may come to you in the form of a grant that you get from the federal agency or the state agency, but you may then turn around and distribute that money as a loan. Now, you could distribute it as a grant, a sub-grant, but you certainly can convert this to loans. And the example here would be electric vehicles, where we know of one jurisdiction that plans to apply for grant funding that would be used to support low-cost loans for low and moderate income purchasers of electric vehicles. So it'd be easier for them to own electric vehicles. So they're going to get grant funding and turn around and put it into a discounted loan mechanism and work with a financial partner to help get the money out the door for that purpose. So just know when you see these sources of funds here that are the incoming to you, that doesn't necessarily mean that these are also the distribution mechanisms that will go out to end users. That's something you need to iron out with your actual program, and whether you're going to run it through, some sort of a procurement, whatever. But, just hold that point because we'll pick it back up. Go ahead. Greenhouse gas reduction fund, 27 billion, 3 pots of money, 7, 12, and 8, used for what we call direct investment, big fat, infrastructure projects, the traditional kinds of things, but also these end use activities I just mentioned, which are these smaller scale things that are standardized and aggregated through programs at a high volume level. So renewable rooftop solar would be a classic example of that. We also see what's called indirect investment here, which is moving the money to intermediaries. And it differs depending on which pot of money we're talking about here. And then a big focus on what's known as the enabling environment with capacity expansion. So earlier we're talking about, are there opportunities for planning, capacity building? And yes, very much here. We're expecting this guidance to come out pretty soon, and also for the application to be due pretty soon. So it could come out as early as next week and be due as early as the end of March. The $7 billion tranche is designed for state level entities. The $8 billion tranche is eligible for others, specifically what are known as nonprofit, non-deposit institutions. So I think the intent there would be financial intermediaries, community finance, investment corporations, things like that, who can receive this funding and distribute it at a local level. Local governments are eligible, even state governments are eligible. Let me step back. State entities, state green banks are eligible here if they are nonprofit, non-deposit, and we're working with one in the state of Maryland who is, for instance. So that's another pot of money. The $7 and $8 billion pots require, and it could be 100%, but we're going to see that require that these funds be directed to low and moderate income uses, disadvantaged communities, et cetera, that will be spelled out, and how that's done is kind of a major issue right now. Then there's a $12 billion pot that is essentially open and expected possibly to go through a national green bank as an intermediary that then will turn around and spend the money through these either direct investments, big facilities, or to local government or others then to use for their programs. And included in that is something we call an enabling environment program, information, education, training, capacity building, outreach, the kinds of things that are necessary to actually further develop and implement these areas of investment. And so the areas where a local government could participate here unlikely than $7 billion, but on the 12 and the $8 billion areas, there certainly are opportunities. So Aaron, thank you for raising this, because very few, percentage-wise, state or local governments in the United States actually have an operating green bank or investment bank that does essentially the same thing. And so we are expecting that EPA will find a way to support their formation through these grants. So you mentioned Indianapolis and interest in starting a green bank. Well, you've got lots of companies. So part of the opportunity here would be for local governments to be able to obtain funding to help get a green bank going. There's a procedure for that. Part of what can happen here is you can get help on starting that green bank, and let's see what happens. But we are anticipating that part of the funding that will be available, and we hope will be awarded, will go to state level green banks and other entities that are specifically going to be helping others start their own green banks and contribute at a peer level their knowledge about how to get one of these programs going with others who are starting them up. So, there should be both direct funding for that, but then indirectly capacity assistance for this coming out of it. So I think the point here is for you guys to be thinking openly about this. And if it's, have a little bit of vision here, if it's in your best interest to have some sort of a financial intermediary that is there to help you at the local government level, now would be a good time, but also a good time to be visiting with your state government. Number one, do they have the equivalent of a green bank already? If so, you should be talking with them. Number two, are they considering getting one going? And you should be talking with them about that process. And then at the local government, do you have the same interest? It's not mutually exclusive. We certainly know of states where the interest is for the state to form this kind of entity, and then for localities to do that. And at the local level, the question mark is whether localities do this individually or whether they will try to do this at some regional level. And we certainly do see regional conversations underway now among local government to see whether a nonprofit investment bank could be created to serve them and block at a local government in a region, and then also work with the state. Very active area right now. Lots of conversations around this. I know this will happen pretty quickly if in fact the application comes out soon, but definitely if this is an area of interest, we might want to flag that and figure out what you can do to become a part of this application. We don't know whether this is going to be a one and done thing. We know they have until September of 24 to fully disperse or commit rather all of these funds. We don't know whether they're going to come out in annual solicitations or all at once at the beginning, and how that's going to work. We're looking forward to these guidelines being issued and reading them real carefully to see where that leads us. But this is a really big heads up. This one's just around the corner, and there could be some real opportunities for you here. I think I'm going to stop here because I know this has been a particular area of real interest, and see if there are any follow-up questions. And then Heather, I'd particularly be interested in any thoughts that you might have around how, this conversation might be furthered at the group level.
I'll first see if anybody else wanted to jump in there. Yeah, otherwise I've mostly just kind of had surface level conversations with folks bringing this up, but would love to do a deeper dive and see if there's a way that, either the collaborative can help support folks get some of these conversations going. I know very little bit about this, and I'm learning just a lot more right now, just based on what you're sharing. So I do know that I've heard folks talking about it. I don't know if they have, how much they're aware of what's going on at their state level. And if maybe that's just an information gap that we could help fill. But I'm already jotting down notes of people that I would like to follow up with on this topic. So I definitely think it's something we're circling back on.
Great. Well, I think there's a state conversation that should happen immediately. What's
Okay.
the state's planning here? There's a regional conversation amongst jurisdictions within a particular state. You know, is there an individual interest or a collective interest in this? And those would be two immediate conversations. And, you know, if the answers are yes there, then I think it's a matter of hopping on an existing application that's in the works or getting one going, but in a way that will give you some breathing room for getting some future work going. Those would be maybe, Heather, the two real quick things I'd suggest. And we'd be happy to follow up on that. This is one that we've been pretty heavily involved with in terms of helping folks get ready for this. We've also been actively involved in actually structuring and launching a specific climate change investment fund in one state. In Maryland, through state legislation, the Maryland Clean Energy Center, which was created back in 2008, was given some state funding to create what is known as the Climate Change Catalytic Fund that is specifically intended to support the implementation of the state's comprehensive climate action plan by putting in place the necessary financial programs and partnerships, you know, to do that. And so the Climate Change Catalytic Fund, or C3 Fund, has been formed for that. We've been directly involved in the actual financial structuring of that fund and some of its launch process, just as a part of what we do. So we're really happy to kind of share some thoughts, you know, for folks who may be looking into some of those issues. Okay. Maybe we can hop on. I don't have too much to say here, except there's a very big issue with batteries. Longer story here. And then on the second bullet, the key words there that ought to jump out at everybody is heat pumps. And when you look back at the tax incentives and back at the infrastructure programs for energy, and you look at where emissions reductions have to take place in the building sector, it's really kind of hard to talk about that without talking about heat pumps. And that's a program that will require end use, upgrades and implementation of heat pumps, but it has to happen at a really major scale. So the defense production side is the production side of that, but on the demand and deployment side, there's other things going on there as well. So if you haven't already looked into the heat pump area, something you should do. Your energy agencies at the state and local level ought to be way out on that. You should already have non-governmental groups that are all over that. But if you need any help with that, let us know. And Nick, I'm going to let you tell us a little bit about this so I can save my my voice for a minute here.
Yep. So like we previously mentioned, Justice 40 is going to require 40% of all the funds to go to disadvantaged communities, underserved communities. I'm not sure if we have the actual definitions on there, but that will definitely play a role in where that funding will go, especially with the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. A lot of the comments that I read from states and localities, they're looking to use their own definitions for low, moderate income and disadvantaged, etc., so that it's not as widespread or wide sweeping as the EPA's or the federal government's definition. They're arguing that it's more informed since they're actually from that local community or that state. But a lot of these funds, like we've been talking about, reduce emissions as well as just local air pollution. So that's something to look out for. I believe the Clean Heavy Duty Vehicle program guidance will be coming out the same day. February 12th. So that's also another one for replacing fleets. So garbage trucks, snow plows, that sort of thing. And yeah, Tom, I don't know if there's anything else we want to talk about on here.
Just underscore that the method for targeting and tracking disadvantaged communities is kind of a big methodological issue. We are seeing states and localities taking a look at the tools that are provided for this by the federal government and seeing that it excludes potentially areas and people that they think ought to be eligible, and by the way, might actually include some people who shouldn't be, and thinking that alternate methods might work better, like instead of doing kind of geographic community-based designations, just determine individual eligibility requirements, and then anybody within the population that meets them would be an eligible recipient. So there definitely is some thinking going on about the best way to do that, and with states, and I think also localities really suggesting that they should have the opportunity to use their own method if they can demonstrate that it's viable and not be restricted to using a standard method that the federal agencies might have right now.
Also, one other thing to note, this component also includes workforce development and diversity. So in a way, it can end up being capacity building component as well.
Yeah, so some of the key partners that are out there in the workforce development community are, economic development and collaboratives in different forms. And some of these are governmental and some of these are non-governmental. There's one in the Eastern Shore of Maryland, for instance, that's a regional collaborative for economic development that is a good example of one that would be the kind of partner here that local governments could be working with. Okay. Very important to remember that rural communities are included across the board. And we see agriculture, forestry being included as well.
Should I
And
skip
Nick,
through these, Tom?
Yeah, why don't you? So we just got some near-term, deadlines here. Go ahead. So those are maps just to show you what's coming soon. And then also there was a tax credit and direct pay. Maybe go back to that just for a quick second. Yeah, so what Nick has done is map out here for any one of the tax credits, which of them are also eligible for direct pay. And I think the direct pay is going to be equivalent to about a 30% cost subsidy here. So it's pretty significant. It definitely is going to accelerate programs and has that potential. Go ahead. Yeah, let's just maybe skip through in the interest of time, more technical capacity building opportunities here. Again, home efficiency, this is an area for end use funds. Back to this need to have in place programmatic mechanisms for deployment here. Go ahead. Okay, this is a big one that EPA says could be released in early March. And it states, tribes, and localities, 2 tranches. The first tranche is planning and assessment. The second is implementation. This is something that you can do directly. You don't have to work through anybody else. And whether you have a plan in place that needs to be further developed and implemented, or whether you want to develop a plan, I can't imagine why you wouldn't want to be all over this and putting an application in place. It also will have capacity building included in it. if you need help with that, we would be more than happy. We have a very high level of experience in the the design and implementation of climate action planning and assessment, the cost levels involved, the time periods involved, the terms of reference, all those kinds of things. This is one of the things that's a bread and butter thing for our organization. So if you need help understanding how much money should we be asking for and for what, we can help you pretty quick on that. But again, this is just such a golden opportunity that's sitting out there. I just can't imagine why we don't have every locality in every state in the country submitting an application for this. Okay. Anything to add or anything we missed here?
No, but I think I don't know if we want to jump into the discussion. For sake of time, we have about 10 minutes. And it would be great to discuss next steps in the last 5. And so if there are any initial thoughts regarding the Inflation Reduction Act and where you see opportunity for your government, we would love to hear from you. Feel free to just chime in or pop in the chat. Okay, if we're not hearing anything, I think we can maybe move on to next steps. If that's okay with you, Tom, Nick, and Ariana. Great. Oh wait, there's something in the chat.
Well, it's from Anna, and maybe this gets into next steps, and then I see the follow-on question. I think an opportunity we have is to help you. Let's just say we're talking about the climate reduction, the climate pollution reduction program. Maybe help you understand a more or less standard application that you can use as a starting place for this, so that instead of everybody doing something totally different and trying to figure that out on your own, we might be able to help a little bit, and you might be able to help each other put in place kind of a standard thing that you could move forward with. And that would accelerate your ability. And this falls into the arena of you guys sharing information between each other and a real opportunity. And then to, use some of the standardized approaches for applications as you do that. The other would be, there are some areas where possibly you might want to do multi-jurisdiction applications. And, goodness, we've got competitive grants, and your ability to compete may be higher if you're joining forces. And maybe this is a huge slug of funding that you want to get into a regional local government thing on heat pump deployment, and putting in place, programs in every local government level, but then are operating within a regional marketplace to get these incentives out. I don't know, but there certainly are active conversations underway about potential for multi-jurisdiction applications for any of these things, as well as the interest in single applications being helped by a standardized approach that can make it a little bit easier for you to do this. I don't know where everybody is in terms of having access to other forms of technical assistance like grant writing, but that certainly has been a big issue. And we can help a bit with that. But I think part of what you'll want to do is understand what your options are for grant writing assistance. I think everybody that's been through the grant process knows it gets a little bit weedy and it can take some time.
Great. I think I'll go ahead and move on then, if that's okay, Tom?
Yep.
Perfect. So we will be attending the Midwest Climate Summit, and we would love to meet with those that are interested in our assistance. And so I will reach out after this call to all the participants, or Heather will, and we'll be providing these slides as well as a matrix. And in this matrix, it's going to be specialized to all the different sectors and where the priority areas will be. And then we'll be meeting. We would like to schedule a time at the summit to meet with you one-on-one to do some targeted assistance. And so there will be a follow-up after this. And if you have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out. I will put my email in the chat. And if you have any other questions, we can use these last few minutes.
Before we close, Heather, I did want to thank you for inviting us to share information with everybody today. We really appreciate that. And on behalf of the Climate Group and CCS, we really are happy to have this opportunity and then opportunities to follow up, and would love to know everybody's individual thoughts. But I know you've been in touch with so many different representatives in local government across the board. You may also have a sense of kind of the broader patterns of interest here that we could, follow up and talk about.
Yes, thank you so much for sharing this information. And I would love to follow up and this idea of the multi-jurisdictional applications, if there's a way that we can help, fill those gaps, I think that would be a really great role for this collaborative and provide a much needed service based on what I'm hearing about capacity concerns from so many of our members and our stakeholders. So thank you.
Jillian and Heather both, maybe I could just ask, and this will turn into a question to others, just to maybe make best use of the time that I think will be together at the Midwest Summit and are going to be available for one-on-one conversations. What is it that we would ideally like, our compadres and local government to have in hand for the meeting? Do we want to be at a stage where you've already thought about, what your top couple of priorities are and then get specific about them? Is there something else we want people to be prepared to discuss as they come into those meetings?
That's a great question. And I'm happy to send out information to folks so that they come ready. So whatever you all think will help advance the conversation, or anybody on this call, if if you've got thoughts about what you have, or I'm definitely curious and happy to spread the word. I mean, my sense is most of the folks here and a lot of other members do have some sort of climate action plan. Some of them are more specific than others. And I think that's what they're interested in looking at is, okay, where are my priorities? Where are the funding opportunities? Where can I get the biggest bang for my buck? So part of identifying the priorities, I think, for some folks is based on, what funding is going to be available, what can they leverage, what can they take advantage of.
Heather, there's a mapping process that could be used that folks may already be doing, but we'd be happy to talk further about, how that could be undertaken by anybody individually or collectively that does exactly that kind of thing.
When we're using a conference app, so we'll be able to start communicating with folks hopefully next week. So we could put something out. This was thank you, Deborah, for this suggestion. We could put out a poll to our attendees and get some more information from them, as well as share. You all will have access to that and can share information as well, so people can be prepped ahead of time.
That'd be great, Heather. Thank you so much. Great. And so with that, we'll follow up with next steps, but I do want to thank everyone for taking time today to sit into this. And if we can be of any help, please reach out. And we'll be in touch. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Bye-bye.